So what are some of the solutions that you have in place to deal with fraud?
Right. So I think this question is actually really interesting because kind of when people think of online payments, one of the first things they think of is fraud, because I mean everyone's kind of heard the horror stories from PayPal, and sort of like in how they almost went out of business, because of the Russian mob and like all these crazy stories. And I think that a lot of the kind of the subtlety of the stories has been lost a little bit. In that, for example, with PayPal, even at the times of sort of their greatest losses, they actually had a pretty good idea of where the fraud was coming from and even how they could mitigate it. But they sort of made the determination, in hindsight, correctly, that that they could afford the losses and the kind of additional growth that they got by sort of taking on these kind of somewhat suspect users. It was just worth it. And eventually they sort of got better at sort of detecting the fraud, and it became less of a problem. And if you look at PayPal's fraud losses today, they're actually very low. I do think still that well, and alongside PayPal, then I mean, PayPal processes a very small fraction of all online transactions. Like the vast majority are processed by this kind of legacy infrastructure, again, of merchant accounts and gateways and everything else. And these companies, they don't have these insanely brilliant sort of mathematicians and programmers and ML people and big data people sort of curating these models. I mean, they apply a fairly simplistic approach to fraud, and just turns out that actually works. And so I think that, I mean, fraud is just not the kind of existentially challenging problem for an online payments company that people tend to kind of extrapolate from the PayPal experience to assume that it is. I do think I think one of the mistakes that PayPal's made on fraud is that they just don't, like, I feel like they look at it sort of from a very mathematical standpoint, and they sort of think, oh well, if I shut down this user, there is X probability that I'm wrong, that they're a false positive, and like the loss in that case of making an incorrect decision is the loss of the sort of the profit that I'd make on this user. Whereas, of course, that's not the loss. The loss that you make is the giant reputational hit from somebody talking about PayPal and telling their friends and like sharing this experience of how PayPal, like literally in many cases, took away their livelihood. And I think that that sort of short-sighted or like miscalibrated mathematical model is actually a very dangerous way to model fraud. And so we're really conscious of that at Stripe. And I think that yeah, I mean, we can do some things to just sort of convince users that we're trustworthy and safe and everything else, and we're audited to the most stringent sort of security levels possible, and we've hired people from other companies who have spent tons of time dealing with fraud and know the industry really well and this kind of stuff. But I think ultimately what it boils down to is we do not intend to have these stories appear of like how Stripe took away my livelihood, and I think that like. A lot of it comes down to that, and that we simply we're not willing to make those mistakes, and that we're not willing to look at an individual user's loss as being the loss of that profit. I think it's much larger than that. But yeah, I guess coupled with that, I guess very sort of emphatic view of the downside of being wrong on fraud. The slightly more encouraging side is that it's pretty hard, but it's not quite as hard as I think everyone assumes. So hopefully we'll do okay.
Great. Can we give Patrick a big round of applause?
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Neil.